Giselle Hartman stepped out of her white Porsche, clicked the door shut behind her, and let her eyes sweep the parking lot the way they always did, assessing, cataloging, moving on. She got 3 steps before she saw it. The rusted red truck sat at the far end of the row like an apology nobody had bothered to make. Its paint oxidized down to a dull, chalky red, its chrome dulled to the color of old dishwater. It looked like something a municipality had flagged for towing and then forgotten about. She laughed. Not a small laugh, not the kind you catch in your throat and swallow before it causes trouble. The full version, the kind that carries its own announcement, that says, "Look at this, look at what I'm looking at, and confirm to me that we all see the same ridiculous thing." The 3 men walking beside her, potential partners, investors, men who listened to her with the attentiveness of people who understood whose lot this was turned at the sound. One of them smiled. Another took out his phone and photographed the truck the way tourists photograph things they find inexplicably absurd. "Who parked that here?" she said, and her voice was loud enough to reach the building entrance, loud enough to reach the man standing at the far end of the row with a rolled blueprint tube under his arm, his hand still on the door he'd just closed. "I thought this was a parking lot, not a salvage yard." The man didn't flinch. He didn't rush to explain himself or hunch his shoulders or look away. He closed the door slowly, deliberately, the way you close a door when you're not embarrassed by what's behind it. Then he looked across the lot at Giselle Hartman and said, in a voice that carried without being raised, "Dominic Hale, I have a 10 o'clock with your design office." For one brief moment, something moved behind her expression, not quite embarrassment, not quite recognition, but something adjacent to both. She recovered quickly. "Come in," she said, and turned toward the building without looking back. One of the 3 men did not follow her immediately. He was older, somewhere in his late 50s, with white hair and a tan corduroy jacket, and he had the unhurried manner of someone who moved at his own speed regardless of what the situation called for. He stopped a few feet from the truck's front end and looked at it not the way you look at something that surprises you, but the way you look at something you recognize. He crouched slightly, peered at the gap beneath the fender, then straightened and followed the others inside without saying a word. Nobody else noticed him do it. Dominic noticed. But he didn't know the man's name, and in that moment, he had other things on his mind. His name was Dominic Hale, and the truck Giselle Hartman had laughed at was the most valuable vehicle in that parking lot. More valuable than the silver Tesla, more valuable than the Range Rover with the tinted windows, more valuable than the white Porsche she'd stepped out of. She just didn't know it. And 3 days later, a man drove up from Nashville, lifted the hood, read the engine stamp number against a handwritten note he'd been carrying in his shirt pocket for the better part of a decade, and said quietly, "I've been looking for this one for 22 years. Then he produced a cashier's check for $80,000. What Giselle Hartman didn't know about that truck would change everything she thought she understood about what it means to hold on to something and when it finally becomes right to let go. The alarm on Dominic's phone went off at 6:47 in the morning, the same as every day. He silenced it before it could ring a second time, already halfway out of bed, his feet finding the floor in the dark. In the kitchen, the coffee maker clicked on automatically, a small, considered luxury he had allowed himself after 2 years of remembering to press the button by hand. Through the wall, he could hear Noah beginning to stir in the back bedroom, the soft shuffle of small feet finding slippers, the low thump of a backpack hitting the floor from somewhere it shouldn't have been. 7 years old, and still incapable of packing a bag the night before, no matter how patiently they'd discussed it. Dominic set a piece of bread in the toaster and leaned against the counter, his coffee still brewing. Through the window above the sink, he could see the truck sitting in the driveway, and the early light was catching the oxidized red paint in a way that almost made it glow the same light, the same truck, the same window he'd been looking through for 3 years now, ever since he'd moved back into his father's house after the funeral. Before that, he had looked at that truck from this exact window as a child, standing on his toes at the counter, watching his father circle it on Sunday mornings with a chamois cloth and a bottle of spray wax, working in slow and deliberate strokes like a man who had nowhere better to be and no desire to be anywhere else. Noah appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing one shoe. His backpack hung off his right shoulder, unzipped, listing dangerously to one side. "Dad," he said, "is our truck old?" Dominic turned and looked at his son. "Our truck has history," he said. Noah considered this the way 7-year-olds consider most things, tilting his head to one side. running the answer through whatever internal process he used to evaluate whether something was sufficient. Apparently it was. He sat down at the table and pulled his plate closer. Today was not an ordinary day. Dominic had been working toward this appointment for 3 weeks. Hartman Realty Group was in the middle of a full interior renovation of their new downtown office building, custom millwork throughout, built-in shelving across 3 floors, a lobby feature wall, the kind of job that could carry a small operation through most of a calendar year without the constant low-grade anxiety of chasing the next contract. His portfolio was solid. His bid was clean. He had been over the drawings 4 times. He set Noah's toast on the table, poured 2 glasses of orange juice, and went to the bedroom to change into the cleanest work shirt he owned. Not a dress shirt. He wasn't going to pretend to be something he wasn't, but a pressed button-down, dark blue, no stains, no fraying at the collar. He rolled the blueprints into their tube, checked the latch twice, and carried them to the kitchen. "You're dressed fancy," Noah said. "It's a meeting. Will they say yes?" Dominic picked up his son's juice glass and moved it away from the edge of the table. "Maybe," he said. "But either way, we're good." At 7:38, he dropped Noah at the school gate. Noah waved from the sidewalk, both arms, like he was flagging down a plane. "Do good, Dad," he called. Dominic raised 2 fingers off the steering wheel in acknowledgement, waited until his son disappeared through the gate, and pulled back into traffic. He didn't know yet, driving downtown that morning with his blueprints in the passenger seat and his coffee in the cup holder, that this day would stay with him for the rest of his life, though not for the reason he was hoping. The truck Dominic drove to that appointment was a 1967 Ford F-100 custom cab, and it had been in his family for 56 years without a single significant modification. His grandfather had bought it new at a dealership in Memphis in the spring of 1967. He paid cash, counted out the bills at the salesman's desk, and drove home with 2 of his kids riding in the truck bed, their arms thrown over the side, watching the road unspool behind them. The truck was red then, the kind of red that looks like it means something, and the chrome on the grille caught the light like a mirror. His father had taken ownership in 1991, when the grandfather's hands had gotten too stiff for long drives. By then, the paint had mellowed into its first stages of oxidation, and the chrome had begun its slow retreat from brilliance, but the engine had never been rebuilt, the cab had never been reupholstered, and not a single bolt had been changed that didn't absolutely need changing. His father believed that originality was its own form of integrity, and he said so plainly when the subject came up. "A truck that's been painted over isn't the same truck anymore," he used to say, working the chamois in slow circles on Sunday mornings. "You can cover something up, but you can't make it what it was." When his father died, Dominic found a small envelope in the kitchen drawer, his name written on the front in his father's careful block letters, the kind of handwriting that came from a man who wrote slowly and chose every word deliberately. Inside was a single folded piece of paper with 5 words. "Don't sell it, not yet." Dominic had read that note 100 times. He understood the first part without any difficulty. He was never entirely sure about the second. What he did know, because his father had told him once, in a rare moment of plainspokenness, was that the truck was what collectors called a matching numbers vehicle. The engine, transmission, and chassis all carried their original factory stampings, never swapped, never replaced, never touched. He knew the body had never been resprayed. He knew the interior was unmolested from the factory floor. The steering wheel still wore its original covering. The dashboard gauges still carried their original faces. The radio knob still bore the faint outline of a factory sticker that no one in 56 years had ever peeled away. He knew these things. He had simply never needed to do anything with the knowledge. Every Sunday he washed the truck the same way his father had, and the way his grandfather probably had before that, not to show it off, not to prepare it for anything, just because it was the one ritual that made him feel like those 2 men were still somewhere nearby. He didn't need anyone to understand that. Until the morning someone laughed. The parking lot at Hartman Realty Group's office building had been recently resurfaced, the lines freshly painted in bright yellow, the spaces numbered with small metal placards. A row of company vehicles occupied the first 6 spots nearest the entrance. 2 black SUVs, a silver Tesla, a Range Rover with tinted windows, and Giselle Hartman's white Porsche Cayenne. Dominic pulled the F-100 into the last open space at the far end of the row and cut the engine. It was 9:52, 8 minutes early. He was reaching across the seat for his blueprint tube when he heard the click of heels on fresh pavement, fast and confident. the walk of someone who owned the building they were walking toward. Giselle Hartman was 29 years old, and she moved through the world with the assurance of someone who had never been given a compelling reason to slow down. She had stepped into the CEO role at her father's company 3 years ago, and had spent those 3 years proving she could do more than warm the seat. She was smart, exacting, and fluent in the language of leverage and deals. She had earned most of what people said about her. The rest she had inherited, and she'd never spent much time distinguishing between the two. She was talking to the 3 men beside her when the phone 100 came into her line of sight. She stopped. She looked at it, and she laughed a laugh that lasted long enough for the men beside her to turn and look, long enough for one of them to smile, long enough for another to pull out his phone and take a photograph, as if the truck were an artifact worth documenting. "Who parked that here?" she said. "I thought this was a parking lot, not a salvage yard." Marcus Bell, who had been waiting near the building entrance to walk Dominic in, went very still. Dominic climbed out of the truck without hurrying. He pulled the blueprint tube from the seat, tucked it under his arm, closed the door, and said, in a voice that crossed the lot without being raised, "Dominic Hale, I have a 10 o'clock with your design office." Something moved behind her expression, brief, unresolved. She recovered. "Come in," she said, and turned toward the building without looking back. The older man in the corduroy jacket lagged behind the group. He walked to the front of the truck and stopped. He crouched, looked beneath the fender, straightened, and studied the grille and headlight bezels. He moved to the rear and examined the frame rails. Then he followed the others inside, unhurried, as if he had simply needed a moment for something private. The conference room on the 3rd floor was glass on 2 sides, meaning everyone who passed in the hallway could see the meeting in progress. Dominic unrolled his drawings on the long table and began. Giselle sat at the head of the table with a folder open in front of her, looking at it rather than at him for the first part of the presentation. 2 members of her development team sat to her left, a facilities manager to her right. No one offered coffee. Dominic worked through the drawings with the methodical patience of someone who had done this many times and knew where impatience led. White oak panels for the lobby feature wall, anchored by a hidden steel subframe that would carry load without any visible hardware. Custom built-ins on floors 2 and 3, designed around the existing column placement so nothing would need to be cut into the structural slab. A timeline of 11 weeks, including finishing with a 2-week buffer he didn't mention. Halfway through, one of the development team members asked about moisture tolerance in the specified wood grade. Dominic answered without consulting his notes. The species, the keyline, drying specification, the humidity range, the finish, could sustain without movement. Giselle looked up from her folder for the first time and watched him finish the answer. Near the end, she asked one question herself, a good one, about the sequencing of trades on the upper floors and whether his timeline accounted for electrical rough-in. He told her yes. He had already spoken with 2 electricians and had a coordination plan drafted. He could send it with the formal bid. "We'll be in touch within the week," she said, and stood. No handshake. The meeting was over. Marcus was waiting by the elevator. They rode down without speaking, walked out into the lot, and Marcus said, "You okay?" Dominic looked at the truck. "Truck's still here," he said. "I'm fine." They drove back across town separately. Dominic kept both hands on the wheel and the radio off. He picked Noah up at 3:15, made pasta for dinner, helped with a worksheet on 2-digit multiplication, and got the boy into bed by 8:30. After Noah was asleep, Dominic sat on the back step with the last of his coffee and looked at the truck parked in the driveway. The porch light threw a dim yellow circle that just reached the front bumper. He sat there for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, just sitting with the quiet the way his father used to. He went to bed without knowing that the man in the corduroy jacket had already found his number. The call came the following morning at 10:44. Dominic was on his knees in a 2nd-floor apartment fitting a lower cabinet into a run of kitchen millwork when his phone buzzed on the floor beside him. Unknown number. He let it go. At 12:20, on his lunch break in the truck, he called back. The phone rang twice. "Carter Webb," said the voice. It was a slow voice with a southern cadence that placed each word carefully, like a man arranging tools in the right order before starting work. "I saw your truck yesterday at the Hartman building. I'd like to talk." Dominic set down his sandwich. "It's not for sale." "I didn't ask if it was for sale," Carter said. "I asked if you wanted to talk." A pause. "Those are 2 different questions." "They are." Another pause. Longer. "About what?" about what you're sitting on." They agreed to meet the following morning. That evening, Marcus called. He'd looked the name up as soon as Dominic texted him the details and was reading from his phone in the careful, flat tone of someone trying to stay level-headed about something that didn't lend itself to level-headedness. Carter Webb, Nashville. Private collector, American trucks, 1950 to 1972. In 2019, paid $65,000 for an F-100 at a private sale in Kentucky. In 2022, paid $72,000 for another one in Georgia. Dominic sat at the kitchen table and listened to all of it. When he hung up, he sat in the silence of the house for a long time. Then he stood, walked out to the driveway, and put his hand on the hood of the truck. The metal was cool. The night was still. Somewhere in the distance, a dog was barking at something that had long since moved on. "You knew," Dominic said quietly, not to the truck, but to his father, wherever his father was. "Not yet. That's what you wrote. Not yet." He stood there until the porch light sensor clicked off and left him in the dark. When he went inside and looked in on Noah, the boy was asleep with one arm thrown over the edge of the mattress, fingers just grazing the floor. Dominic tucked the arm back under the blanket, stood in the doorway for a moment, then went to bed. For the first time in 3 days, he fell asleep quickly. Carter Webb arrived at 8:58 the next morning in a newer F-150 plain white, no extra trim, the truck of a man who had chosen utility over appearance a long time ago and never second-guessed the choice. He was not what Dominic had pictured. He looked more like a retired academic than a collector. White hair swept neatly back, wire-rimmed glasses, a tan flannel shirt tucked into dark work pants. He moved without hurry. He climbed out of his truck and stood in the driveway with his hands at his sides and looked at the F-100 for almost a full minute without saying anything. Then he walked around it once, completely, without touching it. He stopped at the passenger side and looked at the lower rocker panel. He crouched at the rear and examined the frame rails. He stood at the front and studied the grille, the headlight bezels, the hood seam. "Can you open it?" he asked. Dominic reached through the window and pulled the hood release. The hood came up with the familiar resistance of a hinge that had been opened and closed thousands of times over 50-odd years, but had never needed replacing a sound. Dominic had been hearing his whole life, as ordinary and specific as his own name. Carter positioned himself in front of the engine bay and went quiet. He took a small flashlight from his shirt pocket and swept it slowly across the engine block, across the intake, the valve covers, the stamp pads on the block itself. Then he reached into his other pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the creases. He read something from it. "Read the engine stamp. Read the paper again." He pressed his lips together. "Matching numbers," he said, almost to himself. "Factory. Nobody's been in here." He moved to the front corner and crouched, shining the light up into the frame cavity where the VIN plate sat. Then he went to the driver's door, opened it, and stood looking at the interior without touching anything. The bench seat original upholstery worn smooth but completely intact. The steering wheel, factory grip, no cracks. The dashboard gauges, all original faced. The needle on the fuel gauge, steady at just under half. The shift lever, the radio, the dome light lends everything exactly where it had been, the day this truck rolled out of the factory in Dearborn, Michigan, in the autumn of 1966. Carter straightened up and took off his glasses. He turned to Dominic. "Do you know how many F-100s from '67 exist in this condition? Matching numbers, unrestored, all factory?" Dominic shook his head. "4, Carter said. "In the entire country that I know of. I've been looking for 30 years. He paused. 4. From the front door of the house, Noah appeared in the frame, backpack on, watching. He was holding a small plastic toy truck in one hand, a yellow dump truck, missing one of its wheels that he had been carrying around for 6 months and flatly refused to throw away. Carter glanced at the boy, then back at Dominic. "Your father kept it right," he said. It wasn't a comment about the truck's mechanical condition. It was something else, a recognition that went past chrome and casting numbers into the territory of what it means to take care of something because you understood its worth, not because anyone was watching. Dominic didn't answer right away. He looked at the ground for a moment, then nodded once. Carter asked his first question about price. Dominic told him he needed a night. Carter nodded as if that was the only reasonable answer, said he'd be available in the morning, and drove away. Dominic watched the white truck move to the end of the street and turn. Then he stood in the driveway with his hand resting on the rear fender of the phone 100 on the exact corner, slightly dented from a loading dock in the early 1980s, where his father used to lean while he watched the street go by. Noah appeared at his elbow. "Dad," he said, "who was that man?" "Someone who knows about trucks. Does he want ours?" Dominic looked at the truck for a moment. "Maybe," he said. "Come on, you'll be late." That night, after dinner and homework and the familiar small rituals of getting a 7-year-old to stop reading and actually sleep, Dominic sat on the back step with the note. The paper was soft at the folds now. The ink faded slightly at the edges, but the handwriting was still unmistakably his father's big, deliberate block letters, the kind of handwriting that came from a man who wrote slowly and meant every word. "Don't sell it. Not yet." He had always assumed his father meant never, or at least, not until you have to, not unless you're desperate, not unless there's no other option. But sitting with it now, in the quiet of the yard, the porch light casting its dim yellow circle, he turned the second sentence over in his mind with new attention. Not yet, not never. Those were different words. His father had been precise about most things. He wouldn't have written not yet if he'd meant never. His father had known exactly what the truck was worth. Dominic had found the appraisal paperwork in a fireproof box under the workbench his father had been assessed at some point and had never mentioned it, never leveraged it, never used the knowledge as anything other than a quiet private confirmation that the thing he loved also happened to be significant. He had kept the truck not because he was waiting for the right moment to sell it, but because he wanted Dominic to be the one to choose that moment. Not yet meant, wait until you know what you're doing. Wait until the decision is yours and not the situation's. Dominic thought about the appointment at Hartman Realty, about standing in that parking lot with the blueprints under his arm while a woman laughed at what she hadn't taken a single moment to understand. He thought about the look on Noah's face in the school drop-off line, watching not upset, not embarrassed, just taking in data the way children do before they decide how to feel about something. He didn't need $80,000 to prove anything to Giselle Hartman. The transaction had nothing to do with her. It never had. The truck wasn't a status symbol. It had never been that. And selling it wouldn't make him one, either. What $80,000 actually meant was simpler and more honest. It meant a year without the low-level anxiety of watching whether the work would come in. It meant Noah's education fund getting a real start instead of the modest monthly additions he'd been making whenever the margin allowed. It meant paying off the last of a medical bill he had been slowly eliminating for 2 years, a balance that dated back to the week his wife had been in the hospital before she died. A week that had cost them money they didn't have, from a time when money was the least of what they were losing. It meant being able to pass on a job that was wrong for reasons he couldn't yet articulate, without lying awake afterward running the math. It meant choosing instead of just surviving. But there was something else he needed to settle first. He looked at the note again. His father's handwriting. The man who had circled this truck with a chamois every Sunday morning for 30 years, who had turned down 2 offers that Dominic only found out about after the fact, who had written not yet instead of no. His father wasn't in the truck. He'd known that for a while, one of those things you know without quite accepting, until you sit with it long enough in the dark. His father was in the way Dominic framed a door jamb, in the patience he tried to bring to Noah's questions, in the way he still remembered to wax the seams before they dried out, on any piece of work he did. The truck was a beautiful, irreplaceable object. It carried history. It deserved to go somewhere it would be understood, but it was not his father, and holding it past the right moment would not change that. At 7:15 the next morning, he called Carter Webb. "I'm ready," he said. Carter arrived at 10 o'clock with 2 assistants and a third man who turned out to be an independent appraiser, a quiet, methodical person named Gerald, who carried a clipboard and a digital camera and said almost nothing while he worked. Dominic respected that. He'd hired people like Gerald before and trusted them more for their silence. Marcus arrived 15 minutes after Carter, at Dominic's request, and stood near the driveway watching without saying much. The appraisal took 40 minutes. Gerald photographed everything: the engine bay, the frame, the cabin, the underside, the VIN plate, the door jambs, the original factory stickers still faintly visible inside the door sill. He checked the matching numbers against a registry document. He documented the paint condition, the glass condition, the rubber seals, the wiring harness. He dictated notes into a small recorder, keeping his voice low and even. When he was done, he stood beside Carter and said simply, $80,000 is supportable. Full matching numbers, unrestored, verifiable factory provenance. Condition is exceptional given age and actual use. He nodded once, as if agreeing with himself, and stepped back. Carter reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. Dominic looked at it for a moment. Then he said, "I have one condition." Carter waited. "You don't repaint it." Carter was quiet for a beat. Then something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. "I've never repainted anything I've bought," he said. "Patina isn't a flaw. It's the record of what something has been through. I'm not in the business of erasing records." Dominic took the envelope. Inside was a cashier's check, the amount printed in clean numerals. He looked at it long enough to register it, then folded the envelope once and put it in his shirt pocket. He signed the title over to Carter on the hood of the truck, using his own pen. They shook hands. The flatbed carrier arrived 30 minutes later, a long, low trailer pulled by a diesel truck operated by two men who handled the loading with the practiced efficiency of people who transported valuable things for a living and had learned that speed was not a virtue in this line of work. They positioned the ramps, attached the straps, and brought the phone 100 up onto the trailer with the careful slowness it deserved. Dominic watched the whole process from the driveway. He didn't cry. He hadn't expected to. What he felt was quieter than grief and cleaner than relief, more like the feeling of finishing a long piece of work correctly, of standing back and knowing you hadn't cut a single corner and that it was going to hold. When the straps were secured and the trailer crew walked the perimeter for a final check, Dominic raised his right hand. Not a wave more, the way you'd acknowledge a colleague departing for somewhere good. A measured gesture, a signal sent and received. Carter, standing near his own truck, gave a single nod in return. Marcus came and stood beside him as the trailer pulled away. Neither of them said anything. They stayed where they were until the truck turned at the far end of the block and disappeared, and the sound of the diesel engine faded into ordinary street noise. Then Marcus said, "You want coffee?" "Yeah," Dominic said. "Let's go inside." The photograph that had been taken in the parking lot of Hartman Realty, the one where someone had aimed a phone at the rusted red truck and captured it sitting next to the row of polished vehicles, found its way onto a vintage truck forum the following day. The person who posted it was a collector who had been one of the group walking with Giselle that morning. He hadn't posted it out of malice. He'd posted it because the truck had caught his eye for reasons he couldn't quite articulate, and because the community he posted in appreciated exactly that kind of thing. He wrote only, "Spotted this at a realtor building in the city. CEO made a joke. Turns out it's a matching numbers 67 phone 100. Know what happened next?" The thread moved quickly. By the following morning, Carter had confirmed the acquisition in a reply, naming no one, providing no specifics, framing nothing dramatically. He wrote, "A family kept it the right way for 3 generations. I was fortunate to be the next one. The truck deserved to be recognized." That's the whole story. It was not, of course, the whole story. But it was the part that mattered to the community of people who cared about such things. And it spread the way things spread among people who share a specialized and genuine enthusiasm, not as gossip, but as confirmation of something they already suspected was true about the world. Someone at the Hartman building recognized the parking lot in the photograph. Word moved through the staff the way office news always moves, quietly, in pieces, carried from desk to desk in the form of a question rather than an announcement. The facilities manager told an assistant. The assistant mentioned it to a colleague. By Thursday, most of the office knew. Giselle's assistant knocked on the frame of her open door that afternoon, held out a phone, and said, "Do you want to see something?" Giselle was standing at her desk reading a proposal. She took the phone and read. Her expression didn't change in any visible way. She handed the phone back, thanked the assistant, and asked her to close the door. She stood at her desk for a moment. Then she moved to the window and looked down at the parking lot. The space at the end of the row where the red truck had been parked was occupied now by a gray sedan with a dented rear quarter panel. Nothing notable, nothing worth a second glance. She had laughed at something she hadn't taken a moment to understand. She had performed a judgment for an audience, quickly and casually, because she could, because she'd done it before, and it had never cost her anything, and nobody had ever pushed back. She hadn't thought about the man standing beside the truck, or what he had driven into her parking lot, or what the morning had meant to him before she opened her mouth. She was not, by nature, a person who spent extended time in the territory of self-reproach. But she stood at that window longer than she usually stood anywhere, and when she sat back down and opened the proposal again, she found she had to start the page over from the beginning. There was no confrontation, no phone call placed and received, no dramatic encounter in a lobby, no gesture across a parking lot that resolved the moment into something neat. What happened was simply that a woman stood at a window and thought about a morning she couldn't revise, and the weight of that thought was its own sufficient consequence. Dominic did not buy a new truck right away. He spent 3 afternoons at used car lots before settling on a 2009 Silverado plain white, 214,000 miles on the odometer, a small crack in the dashboard that someone had attempted to repair with black electrical tape. He paid cash, without ceremony. He put most of the remaining balance into the savings account he'd opened for Noah's education. He paid off the last of the medical bill he'd been making small payments on for 2 years, the balance that had come from the week his wife was in the hospital before she died. Money they hadn't had, that Dominic had been slowly, quietly eliminating ever since. When the payoff confirmation came by mail, he set it on the kitchen counter and looked at it for a moment, then filed it in the folder where he kept the things that were finished. He bought one thing for himself, a photograph. He'd found it in the box of his father's belongings, a 4x6 print, slightly overexposed, of his father standing in the driveway with one hand resting on the hood of the phone 100. His father was younger in the photograph than Dominic was, now maybe 28 or 29, wearing a white undershirt and dark jeans, squinting slightly against the afternoon sun. The truck behind him was already showing its first signs of age. His father was smiling the way people smile when they don't know they're being photographed, not posed, not performing, just genuinely present, genuinely somewhere good. Dominic had the photograph enlarged and framed and hung it on the wall of his workshop above the tool cabinet. Below it, on a strip of white painter's tape, he wrote 2 things. First, in his own careful printing, the words his father had written, "Not yet," and beside them, in slightly smaller letters, "Now." Noah came into the workshop one afternoon a week later and stood looking at the photograph for a long moment. "Grandpa was young," he said. "He was about my age when that was taken," Dominic told him. Noah thought about this, tilting his head, running the idea through whatever internal process he used to decide whether something made sense. "Is that why you kept the truck so long?" he said. "So you could remember what he looked like?" Dominic set down the piece of molding he was measuring and looked at the photograph. "I kept it because he asked me to," he said. "And I let it go because he did too when the time came. Those are both ways of keeping a promise." Noah nodded as if this was satisfactory and went back to whatever he'd been doing before. The email from Hartman Realty came on a Friday afternoon, brief and professionally worded. A single paragraph informing him that after careful consideration, the firm had selected another contractor for the renovation project. It thanked him for his time and the quality of his proposal and wished him well in his other work. Standard language, the kind written to close a door without leaving fingerprints on it. Dominic read it once, sitting at the small desk in the corner of his workshop where he did his estimates. Then he closed the email, opened the job board he used for sourcing new work, and started looking at what had come in that week. There was a custom library installation for a private residence on the east side of the city, White Oak, built in, exactly the kind of work he was best at. There was a small commercial job on the north end that needed shelving in a medical office. And there was an inquiry from an architecture firm about a long-term consulting arrangement, the kind of steady relationship that could anchor a year without the uncertainty of constant bidding. He marked 3 prospects and sent 2 introductory emails before dinner. The new truck was in the driveway when he went out to lock up. It was not a beautiful truck. It was not the kind of truck you'd look at and know anything about the man who drove it. His history, his losses, what he'd held on to, what he'd let go of, what he understood about the difference between the two. It was just a truck waiting for its own story to accumulate. He drove Noah to school on Monday morning. Noah sat in the passenger seat with his backpack between his feet and his hands folded in his lap, watching the city go by. "Dad," he said, as they turned onto the school street, "does our new truck have history?" Dominic looked through the windshield. The light ahead turned green and he pulled forward. "It's just starting to write it," he said. Noah considered this. Then he nodded, picked up his backpack, and when the truck stopped at the gate, climbed out with the particular efficiency of a boy who has somewhere to be. He waved once over his shoulder without looking back. Dominic watched him go, then pulled away from the curb and merged back into traffic. People tend to assume that rust is a sign of something that has died. A truck left out in the weather, forgotten, given up on. But that's not what rust is. Rust is oxidation, a surface responding to time, to moisture, to everything the world has pressed against it across the years. A truck that rusted was a truck that was out in the weather. A truck that was out in the weather was a truck that was being used, that was carrying things that mattered enough to someone to drive it even when it wasn't polished, even when it wasn't perfect, even when someone standing in a parking lot looked at it and decided, at a glance, that it wasn't worth taking seriously. The phone 100 sat now in a climate-controlled storage facility in Nashville, precisely documented, precisely cared for, in the hands of a man who had spent 30 years learning how to recognize something worth keeping. It would outlast the Porsche that had been parked 12 spaces away from it that morning. It would outlast a lot of things. And Dominic Hale drove a 2009 Silverado with a cracked dashboard and over 200,000 miles on it, and a son who asked good questions and believed without requiring any evidence that his father could handle whatever came next, which, on balance,